Whoops, sorry. All right. Those of you on the stream, welcome this morning. I'm glad you are here, a part of the show. Uh, my goodness, just another critical time we've arrived at in the history of mankind, uh, which I'll get into here in a moment, just as soon as I can get started here with K-Talk Radio. Hopefully, I will be broadcasting there as well, as soon as this commercial's over with. All right. All right, looks like we are in business. Good morning, everybody. It is Monday, April 21st, 2025. You're listening to the Jack Stockwell Radio Talk Show program at K-Talk and at Global Affairs Unfiltered on the stream. And as I was saying, there's plenty of things. I've been watching the news this morning, mostly about the Pope, who passed away this morning. Surprise to some, no surprise to others, but watching, a recounting of his experience, his life, and his experience as the Pope, and why I thought he was a good Pope, and why I thought maybe he wasn't. Certainly a different, first kind of socialist-oriented Pope that we've had. But did a lot of good, but then some things I had questions about. But be that as it may, he's now out of the way. The conclave will be called here pretty quick. And usually within a week or so, you've got a new pope. And they were going over the specifics as to how they make that decision in the sense of the vote. And it takes a 2/3 vote. And if you get the 2/3 majority, then you're the next pope. And I like that. I think that's a good way to choose a church leader. Because there's a lot of dynamics involved with getting total support instead of just yes men around you, getting some total support from different directions all around the world. I think it's a great idea, a good idea to choose a religious leader in that frame. Okay, so the strategic situation. I always like to address that on a Monday morning. The strategic situation that is going on around the planet here on Global Affairs Unfiltered. With only 3 months now of Trump in the White House, you've got this. You have this tariff war, you've got this unresolved crisis in the Ukraine that continues to be unresolved, and in the direction that some people are taking it, it will remain unresolved. And on all these topics, you've got this incredibly dangerous situation in the Middle East. So I want to go through these in the time that we have this morning. And thanks to K-Talk management that the system seems to be up and running. And I need to turn on my messages here so that I can hear from the crowd what kind of a job we're doing. All right, so whenever you, the swearing in of President Trump on Inauguration Day, and the swearing in of his cabinet people, have you ever, as I have, mouthed those words yourself? That you swear an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic, and and faithfully serve and this kind of stuff. That you probably have, just like me. You mouth those words to yourself, that you will defend the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic. And at this particular moment, the 21st day of April, our enemies abroad and our enemies at home are on the ascendancy. And I'm very distressed as what is happening in this country, which seems to parallel what's going on in other Western nations, especially European nations. The loss of the freedom of speech, the loss of the freedom of assembly, the loss of the right to petition the government for the redress of wrongs, and what our country is doing in the complicity that's involved with in the crimes in the Middle East, as well as threats to Russia, because we still have neocons speaking their mind in this administration about Russia and the neocon view, and these are very dangerous. I mean, internationally, the foreign dimension of all of this is that we're working now through Hegseth's efforts in the Pacific for a major military confrontation with China. I mean, we've already engaged and currently are engaged in economic warfare in China. And I think the compass here is incorrect, because if we go to war with China, we will lose that war. That's all there is to it. We will lose it decisively, as we have lost the war in the Ukraine and our war against the Russian Federation. We've lost that war. And I can't say anything positive. I've been looking for something positive about our current political and economic, military role that we're playing in the Far East, which continues to mount the fear of war, as well as the continuing horror of what's going on in the Middle East. And the major result of this is being the destruction of the vestiges of international law, which usually happens before war breaks out. We have genocide in the Middle East, which has been verified by the International Court of Justice, by the International Criminal Court, by every major non-governmental organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, so forth. And yet here in America, we continue to be in denial. We continue to be in support of this stuff. And just like this, even the shooting to pieces of aid workers, of people bringing food, people bringing water, people bringing medicine. And I know that was a controversial subject to some degree, even though a lot of the Israeli press was covering it, not here. But now finally the IDF has come out and admitted, yeah, we shot to pieces one of those things. And they smash these vehicles, sometimes with the people still in them, and then they bury them. And they finally uncovered one here recently. This is in international news, not American news. You won't see this here in America. And we just here in this country continue to be in denial about this. And in Europe, my goodness, it's as confusing as it is ironic. I mean, I believed initially the Europeans, had gone along with the United States in refusing to engage in diplomacy with Russia and basically forcing the Russian Federation into a choice between accepting hostile forces on their border or using hostile force of their own to remove them. And I thought Europeans went along with this, somewhat reluctantly, and now we have this ironic situation where Trump, although he's not very focused, and I don't think he's very well informed, because I think he's got some bad advice being given to him, and not competent in diplomacy. He might be very competent in the art of the deal, but when it comes to diplomacy and his attempts to try to end this war in the Ukraine on terms which would produce this rapprochement now between the United States and Russia, and Europeans are, by contrast, the Europeans are engaging in these discussions, not of political solutions to Europe's security issues, but to military solutions which are infeasible and will never, ever, ever be accepted by the Russians. And therefore, they're very dangerous. And there are meetings going on in Paris now between the Europeans and senior Americans involved in the discussions with Moscow. That is Trump's business crony and friend, real estate billionaire from New York, Stephen Witkoff, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States. But it appears that the European agenda continues to be one of warfare and not diplomacy. Now, this is just an introduction to what can only be described as a very dangerous mess, not just for Europeans, not just for Americans, but the whole world. And I haven't even got to the trade war or the tariff tantrum or the other developments that are going on right now. But in focusing on Europe and what is going on there, most people have thought, at least until recently, that most Europeans are just vassals of the United States. At least that's what Macron said at one point. And now it turns out, with Trump in the White House, it's not the United States, it's this different mechanism that's in charge. And it's for sure more British than American, because it's clearly, you know, what people are calling the deep state, and it's much more British than American. And it's obviously not a question of nations against nations. It's a kind of a network of a certain ideology, fascist, mind you, that's trying to bring everything into one big collective, reminiscent of post-Weimar Germany. Now, for the last 8 years, the post-World War II period, both the Cold War and the subsequent period of the American unipolar, unilateral control of the planet, Europeans have followed American leadership. And which is to say that the Europeans didn't make an effort to define a European order on their own. They deferred to the United States to create and sustain one because of all the aid they kept getting from the United States. But that American leadership is now gone. And the Europeans no longer are following the United States. They may be excused for not doing so, but only because the lead that's being offered by the United States right now is quite chaotic, erratic, flip-flopping change, apparently at the whim of President Trump. But the fact is, it's the American leadership in Europe which has been a mainstay of order between the member states of Europe. It's now dead. And we have the phenomenon that the Europeans who really historically have an experience, you know, many occasions, I mean, the Peace of Westphalia that I keep bringing up all the time, where a very important diplomatic history in the history of Europe, the Peace of Westphalia that went on for 150 years. Well, they finally decided, let's stop killing each other. Let's do business with one another. What do you want? Here's what we want. Let's see if we can do business. And it went on for 150 years. Now, if you're a European, you live in a country next to anyone who can counterattack you if you attack them. Most of the countries of Europe, Portugal might be an exception, but most of the countries of Europe are in contact with several other countries, and they've kind of learned to live together in peace to some degree, because if you attack them, they're going to counterattack you. They don't have to mount a large army or Air Force or Navy or anything. They just march right across the border and come right back at you. Here, by contrast, we have two wide oceans, and we have good neighbors. Unfortunately, we're kind of going out of our way to alienate them at the moment, even the Canadians who don't deserve it, and nor do the Mexicans. And the Europeans understand that diplomacy is a far preferable course to warfare. And the Europeans have historically practiced diplomacy. Modern diplomacy actually was born in Italy and France. You know, Italy was at war with itself for a long time. Italy isn't even 200 years old. It was in the 1800s, around the time of the Civil War, that the various states that made up the geographical area of Italy finally came together and created a nation. But they learned how to stop killing each other and to come together in a united effort. France did the same thing after the monarchical period was over with. And so now we have the United States attempting to practice some sort of diplomacy, and Europeans are, forswearing diplomacy in the favoring instead the use of force, which makes no sense. So the discussions in Paris that are going on now appear to have pitted the European participants, Germany, France, England, and others, against the Americans, arguing for the presence of a NATO force or a force drawn from NATO European members to be placed on the ground in the Ukraine, which the Russians have made it clear from the very beginning that this was the casus belli. Now, I'm sure there's a good reason. All right, I put the radio station on mute. So these discussions in Paris, ignoring the fact that this war in the Ukraine didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014. And with the coup d'etat in Kyiv and the subsequent developments. And so I think it's very strange. It's almost inexplicable, actually. I mean, but Germany apparently is debating right now as a part of the military approach in dealing with Russia, and the situation in Ukraine is apparently debating supplying the Taurus missiles to the Ukraine, which would strike deep into Russia, and which the Russians have made it clear they would feel obligated to retaliate against. One hopes with conventional weaponry, but possibly with nuclear weapons. So the one good thing that Trump has done over there that I like is pulling out the monetary and the military, although it's been reestablished to some degree, support of the Ukraine. What is... I'm sorry, but something was playing there at K-Talk. I'm sorry to do that to you streamers. But that's, that's kind of how it looks right now. So Germany is not unlike other Europeans in that it is running enormous risks that are very foolish. That's just simply not necessary because Ukraine has lost the war. And it's not surprising, by the way, that someone who has lost a war asks for a ceasefire like Zelensky's doing now. And it's not all that clear to me that why those who are winning the war would ever agree to a ceasefire without achieving the objectives of that war. And the objectives of that war have been clearly stated by the Russians, and there's three things. First, this began with this demand for linguistic and cultural rights of the Russian speakers in the Ukraine. It's a minority of 29% of the Ukraine, as it then existed. But that's what finally created this special military operation where Putin finally invaded the Ukraine, because the other two-thirds of the Ukraine were attacking and killing the ethnic Russian group in the east. And the second and probably more important objective, besides reestablishing cultural linguistic rights of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, is no NATO presence, no foreign military presence hostile to Russia on Russia's border with the Ukraine. And the third and the most important demand, actually, I think, is this dialogue about a European security architecture, which would replace the division between Europe and the West and Russia and the military confrontation that's going on between the two, with a new order that would relieve Russians of the sense of threat that they get from NATO and relieve NATO and the West from the threat that they perceive that they're getting from Russia. So a general détente, a rapprochement, some new architecture that would ensure that all the Europeans and the Russians were part of a cooperative security system which guaranteed order and security and prosperity for all of Europe and Western Asia. And this is not even being discussed. The Russians have made it clear over the last several years this isn't a suggestion on their part. This is what they demand in order for the military operation to stop. But on the Western side, they're figuring about, well, if the Americans aren't going to supply weapons, then we need to band together as a coalition of the willing and get the weapons and boots on the ground in the Ukraine to defend the Ukrainians against the Russian aggression. You could probably create an entire year course in psychology, of pathological psychology, abnormal psychology, based on the thinking that's coming out of Europe. And this isn't even being discussed. I mean, we're in a kind of a sterile period of strategy. We have a strategy deficit. And I think it's more important than the trade deficit that this country is going on. More important than our trade deficit is the strategy deficit that's going on in Europe that's continuing to incite the Russians. And to add to that, MERS, every time you hear the word MERS, M-E-R-Z, who's probably going to be the chancellor here in the next few weeks of Germany, think BlackRock. And what would BlackRock want with the leadership of Germany? Same thing they're getting through the leadership in America, obviously. And so he probably would be the next chancellor of Germany. He, just a few days ago, and today's the 21st, just last week, he reiterated that he, as chancellor of Germany, he would send the Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians. And this is a hot issue because everybody knows that the Taurus can only be operated by German technicians on the soil from which it's launched. Probably American intelligence as well, especially space intelligence, would be necessary. And so he says he would do that in coordination with the European allies. Now, there are no other European allies that have anything that could possibly be considered an equivalent to the Taurus missile. So that's kind of a strange formulation he's putting together, but the defense minister of Germany, Pistorius, Boris Pistorius, who is a warmonger among warmongers, because he's calling, as I have said endlessly on this program, excuse me, he's a warmonger because he's calling for Germany to become war ready. At the same time, the Russian delegation is saying, we need to establish a security architecture so you don't fear us and we don't fear you. Now let's sit down and figure out how we're going to do that. The German defense minister, we have to be war ready by 2029. So I would think, with the history of Germany, I don't think they should be thinking about getting war ready. They should be thinking about getting peace ready. But Pistorius is calling for the people to be war ready. And there's an incredible militarization that is now going on throughout Germany, as I have reported on the Monday, Tuesday shows for several weeks now, even to the point where representatives of the Bundeswehr is going into high schools, doing everything they can to get those 17-year-old boys and girls to come and join the German army. Nevertheless, Pistorius, like Schulz, the outgoing chancellor, was against Trump simply because everybody understands that if you put German Taurus missiles into the Ukraine, that's crossing one more, perhaps the last, red line for Russia. And why? Because the Taurus is an extremely sophisticated, has defensive aspects about it, can change its direction instantaneously as it flies, avoiding defensive measures, and can strike deep into Russia, and can carry a nuclear warhead. How do you think Russia would respond to that? So how in the world can MERS say such a thing as of last week that he wants to deliver Taurus missiles to Russia? I mean, even the leadership of the Social Democrats, the ones who got him in, who are getting him into office, are now in a discussion for building a coalition that that once MERS gets into the position that he's not in yet, but where he will have contact with the German intelligence services, then he'll understand that this is absolutely not to happen, to deliver a Taurus to the Ukraine. Now, I'm not privileged to get information from German intelligence sources or any other for that matter. I'm just an armchair specialist. Like any other person sitting in an armchair who thinks they got things figured out. That's where my authority comes from. But I've been watching this and paying attention to this long enough now that putting a Taurus missile into Germany would probably be the absolute last red line. And so how can somebody who wants to become Chancellor of Germany say such a thing? Putting at risk the well-being, if not possibly the existence, of Germany. Well, there's really two issues here to be considered. One is the question of whether Germany and the other European countries should develop this autonomous defense capability among themselves, as von der Leyen is calling for and MERS is calling for, and Macron isn't wild about it, but he hasn't fought against it. And, you know, I mean, I think probably the Europeans ought to have some kind of autonomy among themselves, since they are rapidly not becoming the vassals of America anymore. The idea of the Taurus is not very useful, remember, without American intelligence support. And that has been the pattern of the United States. The United States has been providing central logistical and intelligence support to the forces in Ukraine. So, for example, when some Europeans, not Germany, intervened in Libya back in, was it 2011, for very strange reasons, and created the anarchy that is currently prevalent in Libya, this was not without support, logistically and in intelligence terms, from the United States. So Europe needs to develop this autonomous defense capability. But how much investment is required to do that is something the experts are debating now, and I don't think that doubling the defense budget, as they're calling for right now, is a very scientific way to approach this issue. It's almost like treating, it's like back in the 1930s when the Nazis carried out what could be called military Keynesianism, you know, building the Autobahn, building a lot of military industries as a way of escaping the Depression. I mean, it worked. It got them out of the Depression. It got them out of the Depression quick, but the end result, however, was rather ugly for Germany, for everybody, but especially the Germans. And then the other issue, besides having some kind of a defensive coalition among these nations, so they don't have to do it individually, is the Taurus, and this is a provocation, and one shouldn't engage in provocations unless one is completely confident that what they're trying to do would prevail. And there is no match, there is absolutely no match between Germany and Russia in the current circumstances in terms of particularly the nuclear dimension and the hypersonic missiles that Russia has hypersonic missiles coming out of their ears. Germany has none. And I've talked about hypersonic missiles till I'm blue in the face. The biggest thing is you can't shoot them down because they're moving too fast. Even the most sophisticated anti-missile systems can't shoot down something moving that fast. So the Russians have spent the last 3 years in the Ukraine learning how to cope with everything that NATO can throw at them, and they become very effective at that. And at the moment, of course, there's this typical lull in the fighting in Ukraine, not because they're anticipating a ceasefire, not because they're anticipating the end of the war. It's the same thing that's happened the last 3 years in a row. They're in the mud season. Winter is leaving, the frozen ground is thawing, there isn't enough sunshine and dry air yet to dry out the mud, and you can't move these multi-ton vehicles in the mud. So things have kind of calmed down, but once the mud dries out, you're going to see an onslaught from the Russians you haven't seen yet, all along the Kremlin-Ukrainian defense line. And I think all of this should argue for some urgent effort to save the Ukraine. I mean, at least what's left of it, from further diminution and by total conquest by the Russians, and to stop the killing. And I think Mr. Trump's absolutely right to stress both those things, even if he's not going about it what I would consider the most intelligent way. I mean, what you're seeing here is an amateur approach to this stuff from a non-politician, a businessman. And Mr. Witkoff, his envoy, his representative, not a diplomat, not politically oriented, another billionaire real estate person. And apparently Witkoff is very intelligent. He learns, he listens, he's a good neighbor, he's experienced in real estate transactions, but he has no diplomatic background. He has no expertise on Russia or security matters for that matter. Still, that's on those in that area, and also in the Middle East, where Witkoff has been involved, where he's been engaged in negotiating failing agreements with the Israelis. He's now engaged in dialogue with Iran. I expect he's learning a great deal from the Iranians, because Witkoff does seem to possess the ability to hear, to listen. But this is not the A-team. When you've got something that's got to be settled, and it needs to be settled yesterday with the least amount of continuing trouble and fallout, you send in the A-team. This is not the A-team. This is not a group of professionals who can deal effectively with the Russians. And the biggest tragedy is, as I was talking about earlier, they shouldn't be getting ready for war. They should be getting ready for peace. And I gave the example again of the Peace of Westphalia. If you're not familiar with that, I don't know what Wikipedia has to say about it, but Westphalia, W-E-S-T-P-H-A-L-I-A, in the sense of that kind of peace, they need to structure a new security system in Europe. Europe needs to reform its economic policies and its cohesion in order to support a more independent role without being the lackey of the United States. And up till now, from my perspective, Europe has been much less than the sum of its parts. It should be more than the sum of its parts, which is going to require a lot of deep thinking and dialogue among the Europeans, which I don't see happening. What I see happening is a splitting up, Slovakia and Hungary and some other nations that seem to want to follow the Hungarian example of a non-aggression attitude regarding Russia, which is pushing them out of the EU, pushing them out of NATO eventually, which could be the end of NATO. And so there needs to be more discussion and dialogue in a sense of establishing peace instead of this brain-dead devotion to militarism rather than to diplomacy. And so when you see these opposing forces, both sides having nuclear capability, where there's no real strategic debate, there's no thinking, no vision, it can actually be rather frightening. You get the impression that we are ruled by an elite, or by an establishment, I should say, because they're not very elitist. They certainly are not elite, but they seem to have control of these countries. And they seem to be more concerned with keeping their privileges. I mean, when you look at von der Leyen and Rudy in the positions in the EU and the military organizations, they seem to be much more interested in preserving their privileges, their posts, their income, rather than thinking that they actually have a responsibility to all the citizens of Europe. And I think, I think that the Europeans have been so anti-intellectual for such a long time that they have completely missed a strategic change of tremendous dimensions, which is the fact that the center of power in the world has clearly shifted in the last couple of decades to Asia, to the global south, to the fact that the countries of the global majority finally want to overcome colonialism. They want a middle-class status. They want to become these middle-income countries where all their citizens have a chance at a decent life instead of low-income, poverty-struck collectives. And given the fact that Russia and China and the BRICS are moving in a similar direction, the effort to completely ostracize Russia and to make China an enemy is just absolutely ludicrous. We could not win a war against China in the far west Pacific. Now, I think Europe is experiencing many of the same difficulties that we have here in America, which is an establishment that is simply out of touch with popular opinion, and which is seen by ordinary people as unresponsive, unable to deliver what the governments are meant to deliver. In other words, the sort of thing that Hillary Clinton described when she called the ordinary people deplorables. People for whom she had nothing but contempt. And if you have an establishment that is ruling in that manner, you're going to get a reaction. And you see quite a bit of reaction in European politics, as well as going on here now that's increasing inside the States. But you have in Europe, here, in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, the right-wing party, which is in response to this kind of a situation because they lost the recent elections by 10% behind the Christian Democrat Party, the CDUs that put in MERS, are going to put in MERS. But now the CDU has lost so much popularity, they're actually a whole point behind the Alternative Party. And which is why it's difficult for MERS to put a coalition together because of, unless he compromises heavily with the AfD is not going to put up for 1 second to put Taurus missiles in the Ukraine. But here in this country, you don't have diplomats, you have career politicians, careerists. They're professional politicians who make an awful lot of money. And you've seen the charts, as I have. You've seen the elected officials in our two branches of the legislative government who go in, not too bad, come out extremely rich, way beyond what those jobs pay. Now that stinks to the heavens. And that's a story for another show. The most glaring example is Lindsey Graham, who goes in with a net worth of $850,000 and currently has a net worth around $42 million. Now, what did he learn as a senator? I think he was a congressman first, and then a senator. What did he learn that you and I didn't learn? That in my job or your job, we couldn't have taken $850,000 and turned it into $42 million like he did. And that he's just one of many. It's kind of why I hold the legislative branch of government in just complete contempt. I kind of envy Canada, which has just apparently selected someone who is not a career politician, Carney, who is a rather brilliant man, who understands the global economy and the changes in the world that are going on, which distinguishes him from almost anybody else in the West at this point. And the world order, there's a particular irony here, that European nations, which were once the great powers on the face of this planet, imperial, colonial, dominant in terms of exporting European values throughout the world, it's a particular irony that as the world order shifts and basically empowers with the global south, the global majority, the middle ranking powers, gives them far more freedom to maneuver that they ever had. That they ever had, you know, in making decisions on their own. And then the neighbor of Germany just to the east, Poland, has emerged in the last decade as a great power. I wish it were thinking more clearly about the future, but as an example of a middle-ranking power, Poland has the ability to do great things right now in establishing a security architecture for Europe because it borders the Ukraine, instead of talking about it becoming war ready and training more and more troops for invasion. The other irony in all of this, when I was mentioning Europe's exporting of European values, an awful lot through earlier when we were still in the sea traveling stage, through the efforts of the Catholic Church, especially in the Western Hemisphere, exporting European values. I mean, the values of the European Enlightenment, the concepts of human dignity, human rights, international law, the values of democratic thinking, or the consultation between rulers and the ruled. These things which gave Europe real moral authority, gave the United States moral authority globally, have now essentially are being repudiated. And genocide. I mean, who in the world 80 years ago would support the genocidal action on the part of the Nazis against the Jews, the gypsies, the homosexuals, you know, the outclassed? Nobody would accept that. I don't think anybody accepts that today. But if you oppose genocide going on today, you're branded as anti-Semitic. I mean, an incredible irony, a great irony. And if you are outspoken against the war in the Ukraine, you're branded as a stooge of Vladimir Putin. And so freedom of speech, respect for constitutional order, the rule of law, the 10 amendments to our Constitution, which are the Bill of Rights, all these things are ebbing away. And so Western actions that are going on politically, not just in the Ukraine, but in the Middle East, the Palestinian issue. With regard to the Palestinian issue and what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank, the attacks by Israel on Lebanon and Syria, and the potential attack on Iran. These things have come together to cause the rest of the world to wish to have very little do with us in America anymore, and to not to follow the West anymore, as they're beginning to run after the BRICS concept. I mean, we fought for our own leadership, and the leadership from the so-called global South, global majority, has yet to effectively emerge. It's still in its embryonic stages. I think the Chinese have the capability to lead, but they lack the will. And others in that constellation are, you know, I mean, Russia is essentially ostracized from the West, not from the rest of the world. But countries like Brazil, that are hand in hand with Russia, lack the international power to lead. And so you see, again, to go back to the thesis of the middle-ranking powers exercising more authority and having more freedom to act, you see Turkey emerging again as a major force in the Eurasian context that is reorienting itself to the south, to the Levant in the Gulf, and to Central Asia. And it has good relations with both Russia and the Ukraine, and it has become vastly more important to the EU than it ever was in the past because of the withdrawal of the United States from an active role in Europe in just the last 100 days. So all these changes need to be recognized, but I don't see any of the politicians in this country exercising the level of analysis and understanding to adjust to these almost daily changing policies. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov already said it a few years ago, that he thinks that what has happened in the West is that the West has moved culturally away from the Christian values, and it has allowed everything goes. Liberalism to the extreme. And that has basically caused the present decline in values and so forth. I was listening to a podcast the other day that had Thomas Sowell on it, who has a lot of good ideas. And he was talking about how Barack Obama is absolutely the worst president that the United States has ever had, in the sense of what he left behind in his wake, and one of which was the complete demoralization of the country. And the freedom of a nation isn't expressed more appropriately, more obviously, than in the moral strength of that nation. And so, putting all of this together is, my goodness, we're coming towards the end of the first hour. Putting all of this together, another crisis like which happened in 1930 that would go to the dangers of a new fascism that seems to be developing, and that new fascism would not come in the same color, it would not come in the same march or the same beat, it wouldn't come in the same propaganda as the old one, but some new fascism anyhow. And I think that one could argue that many of the symptoms that I've been talking about here, like the tolerance for genocide and the total lack of any kind of a positive image of man, is the predecessor of a new fascism. Now I want to talk some more about that. As we're coming here towards the end of the first hour, I just want to make a quick pitch for one of the jack packs that's starting to move. This is great, the foundational one. The one I take every morning. The one that keeps me going. The one that got me up at 4 o'clock this morning to go through the news, to put my notes together, to prepare for this program. And it consists of 4 products: ageless thyroid, for the HPA axis for memory, brain function, for balance of fight or flight or rest and digest, to calm down the need to get upset and angry without boundaries, to bring back some emotional balance, the feeling of well-being, reduce the effects of cellular oxidation. That's one thing I take. And that's a product that Mary and I created 10 years ago. I also take Catalin, the multivitamin, trace minerals, essential enzymes, contains 12 raw foods inside of it, supports the activation of the enzyme systems and supports the entire body, supports repair and healing of cells damaged by oxidative processes. Also trace minerals B12, zinc, copper, iodine, vitamin B12, all the trace elements are present. They're required for your endocrine glands to work correctly. And if you're dragging, if you've got low energy, this is one of the best therapies for it. And then finally, the fish oil for memory function and emotional response and mood, strengthens the cellular membranes. That's what I take every day. It's just Jack's Pack foundational support. I highly recommend it because it's what keeps me going. And in another 8 days, I will officially be 74 and a half. Still going strong. Now, we're going to be coming up here towards the end of the hour, and when we get back, I want to compare a little bit of what happened in post-Weimar Germany and what is happening here. Because I think we're in for a very rough ride. There were a lot of people who were greatly relieved, as I was, that not so much that Trump won, but that Harris didn't. And I knew with Trump getting in there a second time, you're going to get Trump 45 on steroids. Because he had all of this planned out ahead of time. What he's doing now, they didn't just start talking about tariffs a month ago. They were talking about tariffs in his first administration. This has all been set up for this tariff war now between the United States and China. And I will get into more of that. I've got some things that I want to talk about Trump and what seems to be a march towards a new fascism. And I'll get into more of that as soon as we go to break with K-Talk. Now, I will continue with this on the stream while K-Talk goes to, because I have no control of the broadcast at K-Talk. So while K-Talk goes to station identification and the news, I will just put my mic on mute for the radio station because I want to go on and talk about the fact, the idea that it only took Hitler 53 days after his installation as chancellor to destroy the Weimar Republic. 53 days. And what is going on now? All right, so just the streamers now. As I said, it took... I'm going to turn down the volume here. As I said, it only took Hitler 53 days to destroy the Weimar Republic. What is happening to the American Republic now? And this hypocrisy in Trump, where he comes out and makes these pro-Easter comments Sunday, pro-Christian comments. At the same time, he is allowing the genocide to continue in Gaza and the West Bank and supporting Israel for the continuing attacks against Lebanon and Syria. I can't abide that. And so what is happening to the American public, because I think what is happening as I'm talking to you this morning, it's a very contagious type of thing that can spread very quickly because they are deporting people from this country I don't think should be deported without due process. If due process says they should be deported, then they should be deported. It gets very scary when you just collectively throw out a net. Now, some of these no-goodniks who have no legal business to be here is different. But there's some people who have a good argument to be here. But because they are pro-Palestinian and anti-IDF's behavior, or because they have problems with the tariffs or some other things, collectively they're being thrown into a group and removed from the country forcibly. And our country isn't fascist yet in the way Nazi Germany became fascist, because journalists are not being arrested yet, for the most part. People are not being thrown out of windows, for the most part. Brown shirts are not marching in the streets, for the most part. But all the symptoms are there. And on the subject of values, I would just say that whatever position you take on traditional values versus the values of the so-called woke values, which have been quite big, the thing for the cultural elite in many countries, I mean, whatever you say about that, it's very clear that wokeness, which is essentially the repudiation of traditional values, has only been a minority movement, but it's had tremendous control of the majority. And you can see this very clearly in the evolution of our politics over the last several months, because Trump was elected. Remember, Trump was elected with 60% of the American adults voting. Only 60% of those over the age of 18 who could legally vote, only 60%, 6 out of 10 voted. And then remember that of the 60% in the 2024 elections, half of those, 49.7%, slightly less than half, actually voted for Donald Trump. The rest voted for something else or didn't vote at all. So President Trump, at most, at his height, represented 30% of the public. And yet that 30% and the cult of personality that surrounds that kind of thing is enough to undo our constitutional order and the rule of law and so forth. Now, I know how this sounds, but it concerns me deeply with what I see going on. And now we have a president who I think shoots from the hip, has a certain persona he portrays in public. I don't know if I should say this or not. I'm going to say this to you who are streaming because I have a lot of respect for you. He's not quite as clever as Adolf Hitler in terms of how he's eliminating the power of the judiciary, something Netanyahu is doing with a totally different method in Israel. But the objective is the same. Now, be patient, listen. The objective is the same of a unilateral, unified executive, a single personality in charge of everything. Sycophants surrounding that personality so that the truth is banished from the inner workings of government and replaced with flattery and so forth. We've seen this before. It does come this time in a different form, but not that different, and it's very frightening. I mean, it's particularly frightening because of what everyone said about the fascists of the 1930s. They had some degree of an intelligent plan. I don't see any intelligent plan anywhere. I see shotguns being shot in different directions, the tariff shotgun, the border shotgun. It's what some people have been referring to as a tariff tantrum. Utterly irrational, and it's not going to accomplish the stated objectives. I was very much in favor at the beginning, but the more I study it, it's going to accomplish the opposite. And now the attacks on universities, the attacks on, the great advantage in our country and European democratic countries that they've had over the last century, namely an intellectual establishment that is open to ideas and that serves as a magnet for talent. We're destroying that with this unilateral, single voice that seems to be in charge of the United States right now. And we are destroying that. This isn't anything other than the early stages of fascism. And I think we're in for a very rough ride, given the fact that the tariff war between the United States and China seems to be reaching new levels almost by the day. China has retaliated quite tough. To the K-Talk crowd, welcome back. It's 6 minutes after the hour. I've been talking about fascism, the fascism of Germany, the growing fascism here in this country. And I want to tell you my view here. I personally think that the Chinese have successfully developed a completely different model than what the West has been imposing on this planet, by what they're referring to as a win-win cooperation. You know, sure, they get advantages, but they also do something for the country they're dealing with. And this has led to a situation where many of the countries in the world, Africa, elsewhere, really think that China is their friend. Contrary to what Churchill insisted, that countries do not have friends, they have benefactors. But these countries are saying that China is their friend because China's leaving something behind. They're leaving airports. They're leaving shipping ports. They're leaving railroads. They're leaving water. They're leaving agricultural products. They're leaving hospitals and schools. And so these countries that would love to have a developed middle class are turning to China. Now, if you travel around China, which is on my bucket list, I hope in the next 2 or 3 years to have an extended trip in China and take my son and granddaughter, because my son is fluent in Mandarin, and so is my granddaughter, of course. She's 6 years old now and can hold her own with any Chinese or American or any Mandarin or English-speaking person. And what I have seen on the internet, what I've seen in videos of people who've traveled there, some of my patients who've been in China recently with the videos they bring back, it's just amazing. The cities are growing and very proper. The train stations are clean. The trains are on time. They have a train system of fast trains now, I think of something like 35,000 miles. Now, from LA to Boston is getting pretty close to that. But imagine a train track from LA to Boston 10 times longer than that distance. And high-speed trains on that track. And if you look at the infrastructure, if you go to a lot of the highways in the east, Pennsylvania Turnpike, the freeways through Jersey, the things that have been in the news recently, the highways vanishing into potholes, sinkholes, and the bridges are disintegrating. They're collapsing almost on a monthly basis now in this country. And so why is the United States If Trump really wants to make America great again, why doesn't he say, let's stop this stupid, incredible waste of feeding the military-industrial complex, which is producing nothing of value, not from the standpoint of the living standard of the ordinary American, only the pockets of the speculators. And why don't we do instead with all that money what the Chinese did by building our own domestic economy? Let's build new cities. My goodness, the underpopulated areas of this country, bring in water systems, bring in fast train systems like the Chinese have. Why not build new cities, new science-oriented cities, new high-tech cities like the Chinese do, and make America great again by attracting the best minds on this planet to enter into a dialogue with us here in America on science, on space, on all the intellectual things that have raised 850 million Chinese out of desperate poverty into middle-class incomes, where they own cars and they travel to and fro with far less secret police involvement. And right now, the Chinese, they're way ahead. They have in 44, this is a statistic that came from, where did this come from? It was pretty good. Anyway, they have the 44 areas of technology that are considered the measurement of advancing science is broken down into scientific technology areas. There's 44 of them they've identified. And so 44 of these areas, this is ironically the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department funded this institute in Australia called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which made this study. And they came out and they said, since they first started the study, that there were 44 areas of technology. There are now 64 areas of advancing technology. China is ahead in 57 of them. South Korea is ahead in 2, and the remaining 5, the United States retains the lead, while China has 57 of them. So we're looking at a country, when I'm talking about China, that's picked itself up by its bootstraps and has achieved great things. China went through, when I was born, in the 50s and 60s, 2 very lunatic efforts to make China great again. Chairman Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, which was a disaster, led to the mass starvation of tens of millions of Chinese. And then he followed it with the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which was something a little bit like Elon Musk is trying to do in the U.S. government now. And it produced positive changes in the Chinese government, as I think Musk is doing, although that can get out of hand. And so these failures in China were then replaced in the late 70s by Deng Xiaoping, who had a more eclectic, intelligent, common sense point of effort, which has succeeded, to the point where, as I said, my son, in his last visit to China, and of course he's got Chinese relatives now, because his daughter is half Chinese, and as they go there to visit, he says, "Dad, you don't see the state police anywhere." When he first went there over a decade ago to teach English, he was stopped on a regular basis. He had to show his papers. He says, "Dad, you don't see them anywhere." And more of the Chinese citizens are out on the streets selling what they make all night long, supposedly sleeping after their day government jobs, and they make a profit off of what they're making at home, selling it on the streets. So these failures of the Cultural Revolution, what Mao Zedong was doing, the horrible conditions that led to the starvation of so many Chinese, just like what Stalin did with the Ukraine and the starvation of the 40 million Ukrainians, to a point now where they have developed in China this high-speed train network that has an effect that there is no equivalent whatsoever here in this country. There are some high-speed trains in Europe, but they pale in comparison with the ones in China. And the failure to invest in infrastructure is what is leading to the impoverishment of the country. It's not just that, we've become this consumer nation, as Greenspan said, and that we don't need to worry about making anything anymore. We have these other countries using child slave labor to make the stuff that we can just sit back in our chaise lounge with our mint julep and watch the races and have things delivered to us by ordering it from Amazon that imports it from China. And that's catching up to us because, as I said, the highways are falling apart. The runways are falling apart. Our emergency delivery systems are falling apart. Hospitals are closing down. And so President Trump appears to believe that the foreigners should pay these important taxes. The tariffs, of course, are now being called taxes on the American consumer. We're not getting rich from them, we're getting more poor. But if you look at the comparison again with China, their exports to the United States are 3 times the U.S. exports to China. You probably know this if you've been following the tariff stuff. And in Chinese, there's a very simple definition of trade. Exchanging what you have for what you don't have. That's the whole idea. What do we have that you want? Because here's what you have that we want. So let's sit down and figure out a fair trade model that will benefit both of us. Our industries that made what you want and your industries that made what we want. And let's trade it. That's how the Chinese deal for the most part. Now, in this exchange, we get so much more from China than we give. And I'm only talking about goods, not services. I'm just talking about manufactured goods. And we have a positive trade balance on services, though, with China, which the Chinese are going to retaliate against. For instance, the Chinese have just banned Boeing aircraft for sale in China. Apparently, they are going to shift all of their agricultural imports, which are now low in value, tons of it, but very low in value. They're shipping these things, instead of to us, back to Brazil and potentially to places like Angola, which has enormous potential for agricultural exports back to China. Who would be the losers in this deal? If China started taking their agricultural stuff from Angola instead of the United States? Well, yes, the American farmer. And so you're watching here in the United States farmers going bankrupt because the banks are repossessing their equipment. Farming in the United States, the way we do farming here, is incredibly capital intensive. People in America today who actually work in the farming industry is less than 1% of our population. And the same thing has been happening in manufacturing in general. That is to say, from, say back in 1900, 80% of the American workforce worked in agriculture. 8 out of 10 Americans. 15% worked in industry. 5% were in the so-called services, education, health, that kind of stuff. The proportions today have altered greatly from 80% to less than 1%. From 15% working in industry to 8% today. and 1% in, or 5% in services. Now it's 90%. 90% of the American workforce is now involved with services. What kind of service can we offer you outside of manufacturing, outside of agriculture? So we blame China for the loss of manufacturing jobs. But it is an increase in productivity and automation, the failure to retrain workers to use that automation, corporate greed, which outsources production to foreign countries that have cheap labor rather than attempting to increase the productivity of American workers, that led to this situation, and it's not the fault of the Chinese. There are a lot of they got something playing at K-Talk. It's not the fault of the Chinese. It's our own damn fault that we got ourselves into this kind of a condition. Following Greenspan's comments about being a consumer nation, that kind of an idea. 820 commercials playing. So there's a lot of myths in our politics in this country. For example, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the WTO, everybody said, well, this is the end of the American industrial base now. No, actually, U.S. exports continue to increase exactly on the same trend as they had before. And industrial jobs continued to decrease at exactly the same level as they did before. So we have a lot of political myths here, the net effect of which is to enable us, for the most part, to blame looks like something is still playing there. To blame others for our own mistakes. And I don't think the United States is unique in doing this. Now, given the fact that the transatlantic financial system is already in very precarious situation, given the U.S. has 37 trillion in state debt, you have an outstanding derivatives bubble, I think is probably, at this point in time, approaching 2 quadrillion. And now when you have all of these sudden bankruptcies happening in these emerging countries, but also over-indebted firms, this could actually trigger a chain reaction collapse, in my view, much bigger than 2008. And all the so-called tools of the central banks have been exhausted. The qualitative easing has been done. Negative interest has been done. So what could happen in the worst case is a sudden chaotic disintegration of the world financial institution, which was predicted back in 1971 when Nixon went away from the fixed exchange rate to the floating rate system. LaRouche back then was warning against this in so many videos and addresses that he was making, but he prescribed the solution, which was the idea that you need a president who did exactly what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in 1933, implement the Glass-Steagall banking separation, where you protect the commercial banks who invest in industry and agriculture and trade can continue, but you do not allow the speculative banks to be involved with that. And at the same time, you go in the direction of new international credit system, because world trade has to continue. And the only way how to overcome the problems of hunger and underdevelopment and so forth would be a new trade situation. So we have, ever since this war started in the Ukraine, I know that the Schiller Institute has been calling for this new international security and development architecture. which has to be taken into account the interest of every single country, because otherwise it's not going to function. Now, such a new architecture is not only, discussing all the pressing issues like stopping the arms race and going back to arms control treaties and converting much of the industrial capacities of the military-industrial complex into useful civilian economy, which can be done. And then also you need, just like the reverse is happening now in Germany, where one of the plants that make the VW automobile is now making tanks, of all things. And then, and the Chinese, they're just, if you look at this, you look at this in the sense of scientific and technological progress, like investment in fusion technology and space cooperation. The Chinese are way ahead in all these fields. They're the only space-faring nation which has been to the far side of the moon. So when you think of what would be necessary, or even if it's possible to accomplish, to get all of these very brilliant, very wise people from all these different countries to say, listen, this present system is it's running pell-mell, full speed into the wall. And if we continue on this course any longer, we may actually risk the existence of the human species. So do not, wise people, among ourselves, get together, sit at a table, and start to negotiate principles as how to get out of this mess. That's what the Schiller Institute's all about in their coming conferences at the end of May. As I said, I've been invited to participate in that. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get away. But this is a time when, while you are an American and you want to defend the Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic, you definitely need to be looking at the domestic enemies of this country, because they abound. In large numbers. And we are in a very precarious economic moment. And you can see this with the fight that just broke out between Powell, the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, and President Trump. And you can see it in the price of gold, which is what is going on. And you can see it in the trade war, and you can see it in the disruption of the financial markets. And I don't think financial capitalism is necessarily the best survival technique. Excuse me, I need a drink of water here. What do I mean by that? Why don't we have wise people getting together to talk about this? The fact is that there's very few people talking about this. There's a good deal of discussion on the sidelines among certain intellectual circles of the many issues that I'm talking about here, but they don't come into the government. And there's defensive mechanisms that should be put in place immediately. The restoration of Glass-Steagall would be one of the best, but there's no push for that. I've even heard Senator Lee talk about Glass-Steagall. But the members of the House, and the members of the Senate have been bought and sold so many times, over and over again, that there's no push for it. In this country, I almost think the United States Congress ought to just abolish itself, because it does nothing useful. It doesn't even pass a real budget. And when the great leader calls for support, it salutes regardless of how stupid some of the issues are. But I'm not sure where the wise people are going to come from that need to sit down and figure this stuff out. I don't know if I'm going to be around long enough for this kind of thing to emerge. But I see it in the faces of my patients, and I see it in my friends, this anxiety, this worry about the future. And it doesn't leave a lot of people a whole lot of time to think these things through and step forward and take the responsibility in a moment of crisis like this. But this upcoming conference of the Schiller Institute in May, it's May 24 and 25 in New York. And many people are registering to come to the conference, which will be an in-person conference. A lot of the sessions will be on Zoom. But some kind of an intervention has got to happen before too much longer. So, I think that's enough on that subject. I've got some other things that I want to move into. As I'm zipping through the rest of my notes here, more red line stuff. I think I've said enough about that. I wanted to say a couple of things about Iran. There's an awful lot of discussion. There's more discussion going on with several of the Arab countries now, that the possibility of an attack on Iran is being discussed, that several of these other countries, Oman, Qatar, getting very, very worried about this kind of stuff. And now, and some of the comments that Putin's making. But I think I'm going to let that rest until tomorrow. What I want to talk about is one more thing about the Ukraine. Because something that has just recently come to my attention. Because and Zelensky, you know that there's martial law in Ukraine. That's why Zelensky's still acting like president. Ukraine, by their parliamentary vote, extended martial law until August 6. So May, June, July, 4 months. Well, actually about 3.5. Of martial law to continue. And the United States is trying to pressure Zelensky into assembling a government of national unity that would suspend the military and intelligence aid if he refuses to dilute his power in lieu of holding elections. Because the West, or at least the United States, or maybe just Trump and his group, are worried that Zelensky will push this thing through until he's set up a way that, I mean, his numbers, his popularity numbers are horrible. I mean, they're worse than Biden's were at the end of Biden's reign. But they're afraid that he will orchestrate things behind the scenes to get himself reelected. And so, with Ukraine extending martial law until the 6th of August, following Zelensky's request earlier this week, which will prevent elections from being held over the summer. Like The Economist claimed last month, there was a scenario that he was considering in an attempt to give himself an edge over his rivals. This exposes his fear, of course, of losing re-election. And it's not just that he's incredibly unpopular. He's worried sick that the United States wants to replace him after his infamous fight in the White House there a month ago with President Trump. And to that end, the report coming out of, I think it's RT, that the Trump administration might not turn a blind eye to whatever electoral fraud that Zelensky is planning right now to commit in order to hold on to power, instead refusing to recognize the outcome unless one of his rivals wins. And as for one who could realistically replace him, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service claimed last May that the U.S. had reportedly entered into talks with Petro Poroshenko, Vitaly Klitschko, Andrei Yermak, Valery Zaluzhny, and Dmitro Razumkov, all possible presidents of the Ukraine. So the New York Times just ran a feature article on Poroshenko, who took the opportunity to propose a government of national unity almost 18 months after his idea was first floated by Politico in December of 2023. But even the article's author felt obligated to inform the readers that he's unlikely to return to power, citing all kinds of unnamed political analysts, said that Mr. Poroshenko may be angling for an electoral alliance with General Zaluzhny. Well, the issue is Zelensky going to try to pull some fraud to get himself reelected? Now, Poroshenko's article that showed up in the New York Times, which the Trump administration is now getting involved with, but Zelensky continues to irritate Trump. Recently by alleging that Russia has this enormous influence over the White House and accusing Steve Witkoff of overstepping his authority in talks with Putin. And so this comes as the Ukraine continues dragging its heels on agreeing to the last proposed mineral deal with the U.S. So from the U.S. perspective, since the increasingly troublesome bad boy Zelensky can't be democratically replaced through summer elections, the next best course of action would to pressure him into forming this general unity that would be filled with figures like Poroshenko, who's a lot easier for the U.S. to work with. And this would also serve to dilute Zelensky's power in a reversal of the Biden administration's policy that saw the U.S. turning a blind eye to his anti-democratic consolidation of power over national security pretexts as he tried to gather more control for a fixed election. So the pretext could be that any Russian-U.S. breakthrough on resolving the Ukrainian conflict requires the approval of a politically inclusive Ukrainian government. Given Zelensky's questionable legitimacy after reigning in power following the expiration of his term last May, and the enormity of what's being proposed. So in pursuit of this goal, the United States could threaten to once again suspend its military and intelligence aid to Ukraine unless Zelensky speedily assembles this new unity that would be acceptable to the Trump administration. So the purpose would be to push through a ceasefire for lifting martial law, finally holding elections, and ultimately replacing Zelensky. And this unity could help prevent the fraud that is being planned to commit by Zelensky if he decides to run again under these more politically difficult circumstances, especially if they invite the United States in to supervise the elections, both before and during the vote. So through these means, the U.S. could therefore get rid of Zelensky, who might think that extending martial law would prevent this. And to what end? Well, of course, to bring this war to an end. Zelensky remaining in charge of the government to the limited extent that he is under declaring martial law powers may exclude the Ukraine from the final decision on ending this conflict. Now, when you consider Russia is not going to sit there and trade and deal with ceasefire recommendations. They won the war. People who win the war don't sit there and concede. There may be some compromises here and there, but they don't concede anything they gained during the war. And one of which they're not going to give up is the Russian cultural, linguistic territories that they have regained or have taken over. And of course, the Crimea back in 2014. Why doesn't the Ukrainian army simply pull back all of their forces and concentrate it on the Crimea and retake the Crimea and exclude Russia out of a warm water port. I saw that proposed. I thought, boy, talking about an idiot. Russia is in complete control. Russia has the Oreshnik missile. Remember that. Russia doesn't need nuclear weapons to create nuclear-level devastation. The Oreshnik will do that fine by itself. And these people know it. That's why they just, as I was saying earlier in the program, I think a lot of the positions that von der Leyen and Rudy and these other officials in the European Union and the European forces, United European forces, the positions they're taking is order to maintain their position, their jobs, their income, their retirement, their investments, even though they know that what they're saying, what they're trying to do is absolutely fraudulent. So I wanted to bring that to attention. Then, also, interestingly enough, we are at the anniversary of several things that have happened, a few decades ago in this country, not the least of which was the Oklahoma City bombing. And do you remember the name Jesse Trentadue? He was on my show. And I wanted to say a few things about that because it was his brother who, Kenneth Michael Trentadue, who died in August of 1995, and I was on K-Talk Radio then, while he was incarcerated at the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City. And following that death, the Department of Justice immediately deemed it a suicide, denied the medical examiner access to the cell where Kenneth Trentadue was killed, ordered the cell cleaned and painted, and repeatedly asked both the medical examiner and Kenneth Trentadue's family to authorize cremation of his body. The medical examiner could not legally authorize cremation, and the family refused, demanding that Kenneth's body be returned to them. And when Trentadue's body was returned to the family, they removed the heavy makeup and discovered bruises all over his body from head to foot. The bruises, the cuts, and the other wounds obviously depicting beating and murder. Now, one of the Bush-era swamp critters who was revealed to be a key figure in the OKC bombing cover-up, and this is from Zero Hedge, Tyler Durden. And I had Jesse Trentadue on my show a couple of times talking about his brother. You may remember the name John Ashcroft, Attorney General under George W. Bush. Jesse Trentadue said this: "As I've always said, the only difference between the KGB and the FBI is that the KGB never claimed to be a legitimate law enforcement agency." Well, good old John Ashcroft was at the heart of the high-profile cover-up of the Oklahoma City bombing. And the following that I just read there a moment ago comes from a court filing provided by Trentadue, the attorney to the OKC bombing accomplice Terry Nichols. And it talks about the fact that the Department of Justice immediately said Trentadue's death was suicide, that he beat himself to death, and would not allow the medical examiner to go into the cell where Trentadue was killed. And the Department of Justice ordered the cell cleaned and painted immediately, and repeatedly asked both the medical examiner and Trentadue's family to cremate the body. Well, they refused it. Now, serving his prison sentence, Terry Nichols, who was, the accomplice, attempted to spark an investigation into the FBI while he was serving his prison sentence. And he sent a letter stating that he could provide such information to the then head of the DOJ that the FBI was involved in the OKC bombing. Ashcroft did not respond to the letter, but immediately forbade the media from speaking to Nichols, which resulted in 60 Minutes canceling a sit-down interview they had scheduled with Nichols, says Trinidad. Shortly thereafter, Nichols said that he had received a visit from a man presenting an offer from the Department of Justice to undo Nichols' death sentence if he agreed to 3 conditions. Take ownership of an anonymous warning the DOJ received saying the Murrah building was bombed 30 minutes before it actually had been bombed, very similar to the building number 7 on 9/11. If he would implicate Nichols' own brother in the bombing plot, and reveal the location of the kinestick, excuse me, the explosive used in the bombing. And Nichols mentioned having knowledge of an unused stash in his letter to Ashcroft, and the existence of the remaining stash was not known at the time. Now, the existence of this mysterious call was independently corroborated in Stephen Jones's book, Others Unknown. And you remember Stephen Jones from BYU, got fired. And it was even covered by ABC News. And this, I'm looking at this excerpt here. ABC News 2020 reports on how someone called the executive secretariat in D.C. about a half an hour before the OKC bombing and said, the Murrah building has just been bombed, half hour before it was bombed. So it was discovered then that the Department of Justice proxy, Michael Selby, who visited Nichols, previously worked in Ashcroft's private security detail. And Trinidad helped to further corroborate this meeting taking place by telling, he said, after the declaration was filed, Selby called me, upset as hell, said that I had just got him effing killed. The attorney who brought Selby in to meet Nichols is Rodney Uphoff, a law professor at the University of Missouri. I called Uphoff and he confirmed the event. Now, so it's a strange that an offer giving leniency to an accomplice to one of the most horrific domestic terrorist attacks in U.S. history would be presented by someone who does not work at the DOJ and stipulate that Nichols take credit for an anonymous tip which he did not make. Now, Nichols ultimately did not accept the deal because he did not want to throw his brother under the bus. So the story, now part of the official record thanks to Trinidad, serves as an interesting look into the true conspiracies that Ashcroft may have had a hand in. And to see the full spectrum of official documents that Jesse Trinidad has fought hard to force the government to release following his website named in honor of his brother, which he believes was murdered by the FBI. And so for a great interview where Trinidad discusses the contents of this article, it's at Tyler Durden's Zero Hedge. It's an interview between Scott Horton interviewing Jesse Trinidad. And as for Ashcroft retiring, he started a private lobbying firm that quickly secured the Israeli government as its first client. No, I was talking to a patient probably Wednesday about this, last Wednesday. And I said, have you ever been to the museum there? as I have in Oklahoma City, the OKC bombing museum. And you know the claim was that this truck pulls up 100 feet or so, or more than 100 feet at the curb, 100 feet or more from the building. And this kinestic explosive, something, a shaped charge type of thing, blows out the side of the truck and brings down a good third of the building. And then, of course, everything goes nuts and crazy at this point, and hysteria, and which you could only imagine if you were present, you would be a part of the hysteria. I know I would. And then that was it. And there were reports of other explosions that was suppressed. So I asked this friend of mine, have you ever been to the museum there in Oklahoma City, as I have? And as you go through the museum, you see different things that were involved with the blowing up of the Murrah building that day. And one of the things that they had playing in a speaker overhead was emergency services people calling for help. And the thing that knocked me off my feet when I was in there was the reference to multiple explosions. And it just took me aback. Like, what? They're playing the fact that the emergency services who were present on the ground that day are reporting more than one explosion. Because that's what witnesses said. Parts of that building didn't come down until other explosions took place inside the building. But of course, the press covered that up immediately and said, that's ridiculous. There was just one explosion from the street. And it just blew me. So when I saw this article, Tyler Durden's article there at Zero Hedge, I got to talk about this on the radio, because I was in there at the museum that's right there on location. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, references to multiple explosions. And so when you look at the call for a greater investigation of the 9/11 attack there in 2001 in New York, in Manhattan, and the references to multiple explosions, the emergency services, that after, the building had been hit and was on fire, emergency services that are on the ground floor going into the building could hear explosions on the ground floor. And they reported this. And when they heard the explosions, they were telling everybody to get out of the building as fast as possible, because they weren't expecting the building to fall down, because steel frame buildings don't fall down when they're on fire. There's no case of any steel frame building in the history of the United States collapsing from fire until, of course, the World Trade Center. So I talked to my friend about that as well. I said, you're familiar with that? Oh, yeah, we've heard that. And then they talked about Building 7 and the British, the BBC that was covering it, I think it was the BBC, that made the comment a half an hour before the building actually came down that the building had fallen down. And then you couple that with the attack on the Pentagon, where the first pictures of the Pentagon building, there's just a hole there. Then they had to tear down extra parts to make it look like the wings hit the building of a jet, when it was obviously that it was a missile that hit it. And then after they made it, they started tearing down the rest of the thing to outline the silhouette of an airplane. Nobody could find the parts of an airplane. No wheels. Wheels always The rubber wheels always survive plane crashes, as well as parts of the cabin, the shell, parts of the wing, the jet engines. Nothing. Gee. And I don't know if it's just some mass psychosis thing or that we don't want to believe. It's like imagine back when you were a teenager and in a nice, warm home type of association and family relationships, and everything is wonderful and beautiful, and you find out that your father is accused of being a spy for China. And they haul him away, and the evidence comes out and proves that he's a spy for China and is going to spend the rest of his life in Leavenworth. Imagine how difficult it would be for you to believe that there wasn't some conspiracy going on to falsely charge your father or mother or brother or whatever else. Because we don't want to believe the worst when we're faced with the worst. Our brain immediately goes into a defensive posture to convince us of something else because we can't handle the psychic pain sometimes of the truth. And so you had this mass denial that passed throughout the entire country, not just of what happened at the Murrah building, not what just happened in Idaho, or not just at what happened up in Idaho, not what just happened with 9/11, not what just happened at Waco, and the fact that evidence of cyanide gas haven't been sprayed inside the building. We don't want to believe that stuff because it's too horrible. I don't know how else to explain. Yeah, oh yes, of course, the bogus Flight 93, thanks Ryan, where it went down in that Pennsylvania field and there wasn't a piece of an airplane they could find. Yeah, you're right. And so when you see, and you won't see it in the media, the Western media, you have to go to other sources, the horrible conditions in Gaza and the genocide and the targeting of children by snipers. When Doctors Without Borders and Perlmutter, what his testimony, Dr. Perlmutter, talking about how children are brought in with bullet holes in their skulls, not shrapnel holes from nearby explosions, but bullet holes in the skulls of children, little kids. You don't want to believe that. You don't want to believe how such an evil could exist, but even more difficult than that to believe is that our government is a part of it. And the man who promised, if elected, would end the wars, while it seems like there's some attempt to do something with the war in the Ukraine, he's doing damn little to stop the war in Palestine, in Gaza. And I have a very hard time with that contradiction. So it looks like what is happening at K-Talk is over with. For those of you who are on the stream, gosh, I appreciate your assembly here with me. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll pick up some of this thread tomorrow, trying to keep things up to date in the conditions that we're facing. I really appreciate your being a part of this. And if you can, subscribe, whatever, share, that would really help. And I'll